So welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, September 6th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the 2028 presidential election and how Democrats on the presidential electoral map can rewrite the map ahead of the 2028 election and what it might look like under the eventual circumstance, assuming that it pans out and works out for the Democratic Party, that their party nominee wins the general election come November of 2028. Now, on your screen right now is a blank electoral map, 538 electoral votes yet to be allocated. Now, in the 2028 years, many things are possible in terms of how Democrats and Republicans can perform and will perform in many of the states that they have some cases routinely won, that have swung back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, and coming off the last presidential cycle, Republicans are far more excited, I think, about the prospect of 2028, largely because a lot of the trend lines that we saw in 2024 have moved in one direction, that direction being towards the right. Now, thinking about a lot of the other trend lines we saw in 2020, it was a bit of a mixed bag. Although we saw a lot of districts swing to the left and a lot of counties and states ultimately vote way more for Joe Biden than they did for Hillary Clinton, in 2024, almost all of those gains, in fact, many of them saw massive reversals in favor of Donald Trump and the Republican Party in a way that sort of feels insurmountable for Democrats in 2028. So this video, I think, has been inspired by a few of the comments that I've seen asking about, what does it look like if this, what we saw Republicans do well in, Latino voters, young men in particular, a lot of different demographic groups that may not necessarily have been as locked in for Republicans that might end up swinging back in favor of Democrats with the right party nominee, with the right national circumstances. And of course, this is all hypothetical. It's not an election prediction, but rather an exploration as to what a map might look like under these circumstances and constraints that we're working with for the next cycle. And so what we will know, and what has maintained itself throughout a lot of these predictions, is the concept of safe states maintaining that safe and really solid status for the Republican and Democratic parties. What I'm going to do right now is just characterize all of the states that Donald Trump won in the last election and characterize all the states that Kamala Harris also won in the last election. So we're going to start off with Donald Trump at 312 electoral votes, Democrats at 226 as we get across the map here. 1st District, Washington, D.C., and Maine at large, leaving us with the last presidential election. In terms of actually implementing margins, I think this is where it will be the most helpful, just as a basis and a bit of an understanding. Arizona was a likely red state, Alaska, Texas, Georgia was lean red, North Carolina was lean red, Pennsylvania was lean red, Michigan was lean red, Wisconsin was tilt red, Ohio was likely, Indiana was likely, Nevada was lean, Maine 2nd District was likely, Maine at large was likely, Virginia, Colorado, New Mexico, Minnesota. Minnesota actually was down to lean, New Jersey was likely, New Hampshire was down to lean, New York was down to likely. Let me double check on the Oregon front. I believe that it was as well. The map should look similar to that one as we flip back and forth. I'm trying to make sure that I'm not, forgetting what the states look like. Sometimes that happens, having covered so many of these elections. But getting back to this point, I think we are at a near identical margin here. I think this is exactly what it looks like, save maybe Nebraska's 1st District, which is the only one that I really saw, and Nebraska's 2nd, which was tilt for the Democratic Party. That's pretty much where we are right now. 226 electoral votes for the Democrats, 312 for the Republicans. So coming off the last presidential cycle, this is what we were dealing with and what we are dealing with as we go into the next presidential to see where Democrats can really hammer it in and do well and rewrite this map. Right now, Donald Trump went 7 for 7. He won Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, not to mention the previous but not as much swing states today of Iowa, Ohio, Florida, and Texas. But looking at 2028, a lot of the question here for Democrats will be, which swing states can you win back, and which of these red states can you narrow up to a point that it is noticeable? Now, I think that lost on the plot here is that Democrats sort of have a floor of 226. In 2016, that floor was a little bit higher of 232, but ultimately pull out the state of Nevada, that's roughly what you're working with on this map here. Nevada went red for the first time since 2004 in voting for Donald Trump. So 226 for the Democrats is roughly baseline. It puts them, about 44 electoral votes to be exact away from the magic number of 270 electoral votes. The pathway to 270 is pretty clear. If Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania had gone blue, these are an exact number of 44 electoral votes from 10 in Wisconsin, 15 in Michigan, 19 in Pennsylvania. That together would have given Kamala Harris 270 and would give an eventual Democrat 270 electoral votes. I think the Rust Belt is where you start in terms of rewriting the map. And what this would require is winning back a lot of those voters that are in the white working class that shifted back to Trump in 2024. But a huge thing here in the Rust Belt that I think is lost in the analysis, that yes, a lot of voters did swing back to Trump, and yes, we saw young men in particular really, skyrocket away from the Democratic Party, while minority voters don't make up as large of a portion in Wisconsin as they do in Georgia or North Carolina or Nevada or Arizona. What we saw was that a collapse in base support. And not to say that, voters weren't enthused, because they were enthusiastic about voting for Harris, but a lot of those voters who turned out for Biden, and even in some cases turned out for Clinton more, and overwhelmingly more for Obama twice, did not turn out for Harris in the last cycle. And we saw it, primarily speaking, amongst voters, black voters, Latino voters, Asian American voters. We saw it, and specifically to areas like Milwaukee, where you're going to find that, sure, population growth would lend itself into saying that Wisconsin and Milwaukee County, Harris should receive significantly more votes than what Biden did. But that, in fact, was not the case. Looking at them band for band, you're talking about Harris receiving less raw votes than Biden did. Trump receiving slightly more, but in a state that in 2020 was decided by 20,000 votes, that in 2024 was decided by about 30,000 votes. Well, 4,000 votes can make a difference, especially when across the state this pattern is replicated. Whereas in the rural areas, we saw turnout actually increase. More voters were turning out in favor of Trump than had previously done so, and that was the base motivator. These weren't swing voters that had voted for Biden before and Trump in 16. Many of them were voters that had not voted in 16, had not voted in 20, but came out and voted for Trump in 2024. Thinking about where Democrats start, it's there. By bringing out more of their base, but also to winning over a lot of those swing voters that went from Obama to Trump to Biden, back to Trump, that can be winnable again in 2028. And what that would likely end up with is a bluer Minnesota by nature, a bluer Wisconsin, a bluer Michigan, and a bluer Pennsylvania. That would give Democrats that magic number of 270 electoral votes. But in rewriting the map, it needs to go elsewhere. The unfortunate reality for Democrats is that in rewriting this presidential map, Iowa and Ohio probably won't narrow down that much. I think ultimately, even with a very strong candidate, these states have moved too far to the right to see it less than 5 points, at least in the next presidential cycle. Nebraska second, I do think, though, could end up being about +7, because back in 2020, that's what we saw happen. 2020, Biden won the district by 7. They drew it to be more conservative in 2024, but even then, Harris still won by about 5, nearing that margin of making it a likely blue district. I imagine that it would be likely blue under this set of circumstances. It also would return states like Illinois that were on that verge of being likely, right? 11-point margins for Harris would be 16 to 20 for another Democrat. New York, that was 13 for Harris, would go back to that, pretty massive margin for Democrats, especially as you're winning back in a lot of those voters. Delaware would swing. Rhode Island and Connecticut would go back to being locked in and solid. New Jersey, I'd make that case too. And I'd also argue it on the West Coast in Oregon and New Hampshire. I'd move over into being a likely Democratic state, as it was in 2020, when Biden won the state by 7.4%. But it doesn't just end to the Rust Belt. We have to look elsewhere. I do think that in a lot of these other states, combinations of swinging back a lot of those young men and the base motivational factors, but also, too, a lot of minority voters that actually swung overwhelmingly to the right. A lot of what we saw in driving the massive, massive gains, for instance, in a state like Texas, didn't actually come from a lot of these, these population centers where you saw around Travis County with the city of Austin and Dallas and Fort Worth and Houston and San Antonio. What we saw in a lot of these shifts was actually in these very localized areas. The shifts in some cases, some of these counties ended up actually shifting left, if not barely in favor of the Republican Party. Whereas areas along the southern border that directly coincided with the border along Mexico, with huge proportions of Hispanic voters and Latino voters across these counties, is where Donald Trump really made massive, massive gains. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of these shifts in these rural areas did, in fact, drive a lot of that turnout towards Trump. But looking at some of these shifts, 2.5, 2.6, pale in comparison to the 28-point shift in Maverick County, 19-point shift in Cameron County, 21-point shift in Starr County, which in 2016, if you want to really look at what damage has been done in that district for Democrats, Starr County voted for Hillary Clinton with 79% of the vote. 60-point margin for Hillary Clinton. 8 years later, Kamala Harris lost it by 16 points. That is a 96-point swing on the net in 8 years. But that's the problem for Republicans. You see, a lot of what their estimations for 2020 are counting on 2024's trend lines holding up to no end. That the trends they like and the trends they don't like will, in a respective way, continue and not continue. But that's not what happens here. Let's say Democrats win back large swaths of Hispanic voters in ways that you haven't seen. Well, Texas narrows down. Maybe not by a lot. It moves down to being a 5.6% state or a 5-point state as it was in 2020. But that's the first step. And with it, a lot of other states follow suit. States like Arizona go back into being favor of the Democratic Party. States like Nevada move back into being decades-long held by the Democratic Party. It was a fluke on that end in 2004 for, Nevada to have voted with, Republicans because looking at it, Clinton had won the state. Al Gore came up short, but he also came up short in many other states. Tennessee voted to, Nevada and Tennessee roughly voted about the same. Then in 2004, okay, better election for the Republicans, but then Obama won it by 13. And then in 2012, won it by 7. Even Clinton won it by 2.4. Biden wins it. This maybe should have been the warning sign here by the same margin as Clinton. And then Trump wins it by 3.1. But that certainly means it's within reach in the future, already putting the Democrats up to 287. But then you continue. Over in states like North Carolina and Georgia, similar thing about winning back a lot of Latino voters. The thing about North Carolina and Georgia is that it ultimately does come down to turnout and mitigating a lot of the gains that Republicans have made in the surrounding area. Where we actually saw Kamala Harris really do well in 2024 was that looking at a lot of these counties, if we compare election to election, based off the 2016 to 2024 swing, despite, Hillary Clinton getting more electoral votes nationally, Kamala Harris did better in the state and was primarily driven by better results in areas surrounding the Atlanta metro area. 67% of the entire state's voting population is comprised of these few counties, meaning even though 113 of the counties swung to the right, Georgia on the net actually swung 2.9% to the left relative to the 2016 election, when Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, Texas, New Mexico, Florida all swung to the right. Georgia stands out. Looking at it in 2028, certainly a state within reach for Democrats, and with it, North Carolina. The map also, too, would necessitate that some of these other areas where without the figure of Donald Trump in the fray, some of these other states on the margins would narrowly change. For instance, some of these states, if we were just to swing the map by about 5 points, which is arguably what I think you could make that case for, a lot of these states really do jump up to being a little bit more competitive. Montana narrows down slightly. Kansas, Missouri, Indiana narrowed down slightly. Not by a lot, but enough that shows a bit of a breaking away from the mainstream Republican politics, and that many of these states aren't overwhelmingly in favor of Republican politics in the way they were in 2024. And elections swing quite a bit all the time. If you look at the difference in election map between, let's say, 2000, compare past elections, we can actually go ahead. Let's just restart this so I'm not messing it up. You compare, 2004 to 2008, almost every single state swung to the left, and in many cases, in a pretty dramatic fashion. Indiana, 22 points to the left. North Dakota, 19 points to the left. Montana, 18 points to the left. Utah, 17 points to the left. Vermont, 17 points to the left. Massive, massive changes. And they translated to a massive performance for the Democratic Party. Looking at the election 2004 to 2008, a lot more blue on the map, even though it looked like if Republicans had said, okay, the trends from 2000 to 2004, if they maintain themselves, the South gets redder. Okay, well, that makes sense to a degree. But Colorado should be a red state. Wrong. Obama wins it by 9. New Mexico should be a red state. Wrong. Obama wins it by over 15. Right? Nevada should be a red state. Wrong. Obama wins it by 12.5. In 2004, Kerry wins Wisconsin by 0.38. Pennsylvania by 2.5, and Michigan by 3.4. By the next cycle, double digits in Pennsylvania, double digits in Wisconsin, and Michigan is a safe state that John McCain gave up early on. Oregon, a state that in 2000, Al Gore won by 0.44%, Obama won by 16 points. These things happen. These elections can swing. And in terms of rewriting the map here, this is what it looks like. It is very reminiscent of what Democrats were hoping for in 2024 and to some degree 2020 and 2016, and in some cases even, barring a Florida, Ohio, Iowa swing, 2012. The map has gotten a little bit more boring, but nonetheless as simple. The map here can see a swing where Democrats, under the right circumstances, can seriously win back a lot of these areas, a lot of these states that otherwise might have drifted away. That ultimately will put the Democrats at 319 and the Republicans at 219. Democrats swing back Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, and it would be a swing state sweep. And it isn't impossible because Donald Trump did it, and so did Joe Biden save North Carolina in the 2020 election. And these states will be back on the menu in 2028, rather. Wow, really going back in time there. Thinking about some of these other states that might have been otherwise in reach in a better year for Republicans, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, not in reach, but within conversation, won't be if Democrats are to rewrite this map. Solidifying their bases, winning over a lot of these areas, doing very, very well. States like Virginia, too, that I think you would have to see move over into being safe. Just as, Colorado was nearly in 2020 and Virginia will likely be, not likely, but could be in the governor election, there's a lot to see here. And there's a lot that Democrats can make inroads on and can do in 2028. And while it may be, not the most likely outcome, it certainly is one that is within the realm of possibility because Donald Trump did it in 2024 and Democrats can in 2028. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch and then a playlist for my 2028 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.